Francis of the Filth, Chapter 8. The sky above the port was the color of television turned to a dead channel. A curious rectangle of it opened above him, framed by 4 ominously dark walls. Dirty gray clouds blew quickly from one side of the picture to the other, and the call of seabirds, hungry and fearless, echoed across the skies. He lay in a pile of filth and putrid shallow waters with his face, neck, and torso covered in what felt like strands of seaweed. Removing it from his face, he could see it was cold, instant ramen, buckets of it all over him, and the refuse that he lay among was primarily rotting and fetid foods, spiced with acids and human waste. He stood quickly and brushed most of the refuse from him, and looked out over the walls of the vessel that held him.
"What hell am I in now?"
he muttered to himself. On 3 sides, he saw nothing but dry, empty fields, sparsely covered in grasses, surrounded by waterways. He would automatically have assumed he was on an island, but behind him, up against which the lid of the container rested, was a medium-sized building. And beyond that, a number of other buildings and structures stood in clusters. The birds continued to hover and call out their threats. The wind blew in salty gusts. Frank jumped from the dumpster and removed most of the remaining dross from his blue shirt, his hair, and his nose. He turned to observe the building behind him, and from the clanging sounds, smells of soy and miso, and the angry, throaty dialogues coming from within, he discerned he was behind the kitchen of an Asian restaurant. Long having abandoned trust in people, he set off in an opposite direction for the respite of the waters which surrounded the fields. He had barely left the smells of the kitchen when the back food swung open aggressively, and a red creature with a warning, "Do not touch" countenance staggered out. The 2 locked eyes for a moment before they instantly broke into a sprint. Frank turned mid-stride to observe his attacker, a creepy, corpulent character, tomato red all over, except for the dark framed glasses which sat pressed into the fat recesses of his face. He ran with astonishing speed given the girth he carried, and the clumsy, uncoordinated stride in his gallop. Before Frank was even halfway to the shoreline, the red beast was upon him, diving from several body lengths away and landing right on his shoulders. He set upon Frank, dragging him to the ground as predators do their prey. The Okinawan crumpled beneath him. He began to scream and thrash about, kicking and swinging for his life, but he couldn't overcome the power of the red one.
"Frank,"
he said, pressing Frank's shoulders to the ground.
"Frank."
Frank stopped struggling.
"How do you know my name? What do you want with me?"
"Come with me, quickly."
He stood and pulled Frank from the ground so violently it almost pulled his arm off. He looked around momentarily before darting off toward an apartment complex to the west of the restaurant, the collar of Frank's shirt firmly in his grip, and Frank stumbling and tripping in his effort to keep up. On arrival, they stood with their backs to the wall of the complex.
"You do not want to be seen here,"
the red one said in a half-whisper.
"Too many people know you.
"They do?"
It's not safe. Everyone wants a piece of you."
He looked about again before tugging Frank into a corridor. He led Frank into an elevator and immediately put his hand over the security camera, which was staring down from the front corner. Their ride stopped at the 6th floor. The red creature cussed and hid Frank in the front corner of the elevator. As the doors opened, a young couple moved to step in but were blocked by a grotesque red figure.
"Stay out if you want to live,"
he said in a deep accented voice. The couple had no hesitation in withdrawing back into the foyer. The doors closed again and the elevator continued to the 21st floor. Once again, Frank was thrust along, this time to a door at the end of a long corridor. The red one knocked firmly twice and then once, and then the door was quickly opened. With the door closed behind them, the red guy visibly relaxed and guided Frank into a small, barely furnished room. The curtains were closed, giving a room a heavy, leaden feel. He shut the door behind him but continued to speak in a low voice.
"My name is Red Dick. I was sent by the Dark Lord to help facilitate the replenishment of your chromosomes."
"What's in it for you?"
Frank asked, bitter and weary of being accosted and dragged from place to place like a commodity.
"Reprieve from the sea of the wretched."
There was fear in his eyes.
"What is this place? Am I back on Earth?"
"No, this is Godor. After its creation, it was conquered by a peace lord several million chromosomes ago, who modeled a new existence and environment on that of the Earth. It's a failed experiment. Over time, it has become nothing but a hovel for mutants and deviants. Yet it remains chromosome-rich, and that is why Lord Chin Chin has sent you here. The Dark Lord himself will be here within days to harvest you, and if we don't deliver, then we're both damned.
How can I possibly replenish my chromosomes in a couple of days? What sort of fertilizer do you use here, although by the smell of things I'm starting to guess?
On your own, you can't. That's why I was sent to you. You're going to win your chromosomes, Frank. It's been set.
Frank was extremely wary. Recollections of deceitful crawfish, though they were his own, and thieving little runts came to mind.
How do I win them?
It's easy, Frank. You win them just by eating.
Frank relaxed a little on hearing this.
Well, I am pretty hungry, you know. It's been a while since I've had a decent feed, and all that transporting makes a guy ravenous.
Good boy.
He patted Frank on the back.
In that room,
He said, pointing out the door.
are a bunch of demented fruitcakes. They have been especially chosen for this task. They couldn't find their way out of a bath. Not that they'd probably ever had one. But they are chromosome freaks, and ready for the taking. Just eat whatever is put in front of you, and we will both live to see another day.
With that introduction, he opened the door and led Frank into a large open area which functioned as a living room and introduced him to the kind folk there. Initially, Frank was on the defensive and ready to be accosted, if not violated, but he needn't have worried. Those present had either no knowledge of Frank and his ability to cross tiers or were without care, even if they did know. They sat about like drunken seamen, each placidly acknowledging Frank as he was introduced to them.
Frank, this is trash.
A tall, lean man, bare-breasted and heavy-haired, swayed gingerly in his seat before Frank. He raised a finger in Frank's direction in acknowledgement, but never removed his gaze from the floor.
He is a rare species in that he actually falls between mere mortal and brute beast. He has the appearance of a mere mortal, but the intelligence and constitution of a beast, yet for some reason believes himself to be a chimpila. Try not to provoke him by taking his food or poking him with sharp objects.
I'll try not to.
Over here.
He said, pointing to a creature that was clearly a sad genetic mutation of some kind of deer.
Is Jingle Balls.
The organism sat back in his chair with his knees behind his ears, exposing his subtleties and rocking gently to an imaginary rhythm. Jingle Balls was as near to a vegetable as a functioning mortal could be, yet he was chromosome-rich and ripe for the picking.
Very nice to meet you.
Frank said politely. For a second, he was moved to shake the mutant's hand, but that temptation passed very quickly at a second look of his tender regions. He turned to the next entity in the room. There, sprawled across a sofa like a king, reclined a young demigod of a man wearing nothing but a pair of rainbow-colored briefs. Herculean in stature and resplendent in appearance with his Roman features and lush blonde hair, unknowns to him, he was the prize of the event. A chromosomal colossus, he alone could power a city for a decade and still have something left over, and was, as such, Red Dick's prime reason for the gathering. He stood to face Frank and, looking down at the hapless rank-and-file, introduced himself in a rich, creamy voice.
Prometheus.
He said before repeating it again in a slightly deeper tone,
Prometheus.
to evoke Frank's fullest admiration. He then broke into a series of very impressive flexes. Frank was actually aroused by this and couldn't resist reaching over and giving one of his pecs a little squeeze. This was a foolish thing to do, he quickly learned, as the demigod smashed an open hand across to his face, knocking out a tooth and feeling the blood run through his fingers. Prometheus picked up the garbage bin from the kitchen and slammed it down hard across Frank's back. He then returned in a stately fashion to the sofa, where he continued to sprawl as if sunbathing. The other characters in the room had no reaction to this violence, as though it were as normal a part of their day-smelling fingers. It was Red Dick who broke the ice.
Well then, shall we start?
He wheeled a table in from the kitchen, upon which 5 plates sat in a circle. On each plate jiggled a large green mass of what Frank initially thought was the phlegm of a deep sea creature. As it turned out, that would have been preferable. The substance, Red Dick announced, was wasabi, an organic radish grown inside the bowels of horses. The members of this club all gathered around the table and considered the challenge before them. Prometheus did this by rubbing his chin. Jingle Balls played with himself. Trash began some deep nasal picking. Frank dabbed at his lip with a tissue.
Gentlemen,
Red Dick continued.
the rules are simple. Whoever orally consumes their plates of wasabi first shall be the winner and receive the chromosomes of the others, as well as their personal services, he so desires, for the period of 1,000 chromosomes.
They each indicated their agreement by standing behind their plate, with Red Dick taking the 5th position behind his plate.
Start when the cane toad hits the wall,
He said, holding up one of the amphibians by a leg. After a short pause for dramatic effect, he hurled the creature hard against the wall behind him, and when they heard the unmistakable splat, they began their task. Red Dick's strategy was a good one. Prometheus, for all his muscle, was predictably weak when it came to certain spices, and Jingle Balls, like Red Dick himself, was hopeless with the green paste. They were all immediately reduced to quivering, teary masses and withdrew from the competition shortly after starting. Frank, on the other hand, having been raised on a spicy Okinawan diet, was able to soldier through and make good, if not painful, progress. His primary hindrance was the sting the wasabi made on his cut tongue. The real problem, however, was trash. Unbeknownst to Red Dick, trash, being an indeterminate species and physiologically a beast, was immune to isothiocyanates, which meant he could eat wasabi like he was eating ice cream. As such, the young Afroed creature finished off his plate in record time and stood in bewilderment, wondering what all the fuss was about. Having received all the chromosomes due to him, he wiped his fingers on his pants and walked out the door. Frank now had to attend to a bleeding nose, while drinking milk to ease his throbbing throat and dab at his lip at the same time. None of these, of course, were his principal concern. Chin Chin would be arriving in a matter of days to collect his chromosomes, and without them, Red Dick and Frank would almost certainly end up in the deep end of the wretched sea. Red Dick began to run around the apartment in a psychotic rage.
Calm down.
Frank said, becoming a bit unstable himself.
We have to get chromosomes. We have to get a lot of chromosomes. We have to get a lot of chromosomes very quickly.
He rocked back and forth in an autistic rhythm as he said this.
There's only one way. We'll have to steal them.
As he said this, Red Dick stopped on the spot and looked at Frank.
That's it, we'll have to steal them. And I know how.
Frank looked at Red Dick with great expectation.
We start a new religion and have children, and stupid, gullible youth make blood sacrifices to the Dark Lord. The blood of children is especially potent. We harvest their chromosomes from the blood sacrifices and present them to Chin Chin when he comes. It's foolproof.
How long do you think this would take?
About 100 years.
Red Dick was completely unperturbed by this length of time.
Or
Frank interjected.
we could just break into a children's hospital and steal all the blood samples from there.
Red Dick looked at Frank with the expression of an idiot just exposed.
Or that.
He conceded. They wasted no time. That night, Frank and Red Dick did the very deed. They broke into the local children's hospital and removed every single blood sample from it. This earned them many more chromosomes than they could possibly have won from the wasabi eating competition. These surplus chromosomes Frank kept for himself, hiding them in his recesses where he hoped Chin Chin, for all his powers, would never find them. Frank had never felt as powerful as he was at that time. What he was unaware of, though, was that many of the chromosomes he had procured from the children's hospital were actually cancerous. They were, after all, the samples of some seriously ill children. Frank was of the belief that he had just won a great victory. It was a sultry evening when the presents came. It turned the heavy, balmy air instantly into frigid gusts. Frank and Red Dick went out onto the balcony to watch the phenomena. They knew what was happening. The people outside, 20 floors below, were not so knowledgeable, but they could sense the evil in the air, smell the stench percolating in the breezes, and see the turmoil of the skies. They began to scatter about like ants on uppers. Red Dick started to tremble with fear and moved back inside the apartment, wedging himself in between the cushions of the sofa. Frank was inexplicably calm. He knew who was coming and he knew the threat he posed. He was aware of his own ultimate vulnerability. However, for the first time, he knew he had something within him that was of greater value to the Omniverse than his demise. Though not defiantly, he watched the changing atmosphere with a sense of willing participation. As though by command, the clouds thickened and lowered, and amidst a swirl of wind and matter, the Dark Lord appeared in his own sphere of composure, alighting beside Frank on the balcony of the apartment. Together, they looked out over the landscape. The unnaturally colored skies overshadowed buildings and turbulent waterways. The traffic lights and neon signs now rendered dysfunctional, the people peeping out behind the curtains and the dogs howling. He spat in his twitching tones. All this is mine. He surveyed it a little longer, proud of his work. The wind continued to moan. You've done well, he said. You have proven yourself capable. He continued to look out over the terrain. Now give them to me. After a brief silence, he turned and looked at Frank. Frank reached out and placed his hand on Chin Chin's wrist. They both jumped at the transaction. My, so many chromosomes. The Dark Lord rolled his neck with satisfaction and blinked his demented eyes several times. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Suddenly the air turned acrid and Frank was pierced with fear. You've hidden many more chromosomes deep within so many chromosomes, so many. I'll take those too. He latched onto Frank's biceps and instantly drained him of strength. Every last chromosome that Frank had taken from the children's hospital was transfused into the Peace Lord. Frank crumpled to the ground as the Dark Lord stooped down and peered into his watery eyes. Hiding chromosomes from me, he growled. There was a tense moment of finality between them. Good job, Frank. That's exactly what I would have done. Perhaps there's a little of me in you. He then made a heinous throttling sound which Frank suspected was laughter. Once more, Chin Chin wrapped his grubby, long-nailed fingers around Frank's arm. You'll need these, he said, and returned some chromosomes to Frank. I have another little errand for you. No coordinates necessary. This one's express. With that, he picked Frank up and hurled him from the balcony. Frank fell, clutching and screaming into a deep black abyss. He never recalled landing, only feeling the terrain under his back and seeing the darkness. It was total. Frank reached gingerly about to feel out his surroundings. All about him he felt rich, moist soil and fronds growing in thick bunches. He would have assumed from the texture of the soil that it was compost, except that it didn't smell. The strands were thin but robust and stood higher than he could reach in a lying position. In the blackness, he was too afraid to move, so he just lay there, terrified, and listened for anything that might approach. He heard sounds, small sounds, the sounds of distant whistles and chirps and calls and bug cries. Occasionally the wind would moan as it rolled over him. Listening to it, he was eventually lulled by its sad rhythms before falling into a deep and exhausted sleep. When he woke, the sun was high in a pale blue sky, and he sat up startled. All about him, as far as the eye could see, were rice fields. He touched his face. It was sore and felt as though it had been lightly lacerated all over by the sheaths of the rice plants.
Welcome to the rice field,
he said to himself. He stood to see further and noticed to the north a small mountain far off in the distance. It drew him, so he began to head off in that direction. There was a tranquility and solitariness to this place that Frank actually enjoyed. It seemed so devoid of the perils of previous lands, and the climate was pleasant and calming. Though he missed his friends and felt a twinge of unease without them, there remained a respite from the fears and anxieties caused by other realms, and he walked onward with a sense of ease and adventure. He hadn't gone far when this fantasy was completely razed. In a paddock in front of him stood what on earth would have been a farmer. He stood there gently teetering in the breeze as though remaining upright were a major achievement. Frank called to him, but there was no response. He waved, but there was nothing in return. Suddenly, the air chilled, and the sounds of the crickets and frogs were stilled. Frank drew nearer with a feeling of deep-seated alarm. The farmer wore a tattered white shirt under a pair of beige overalls. An old straw hat sat awkwardly on his head, tilted back toward his neck, revealing a stony expression and grotesque, empty eye sockets. The sun shining into his face revealed every dry sinew and vein lining the back of the cavities, and every wrinkle and abrasion on his face. His mouth was wide open, yet moved awkwardly as though trying to speak. Tay, 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 he seemed to be saying, but he was incapable of completing his utterance. As Frank watched the farmer trying to speak, he saw his whole jaw detached and fall from his face, only to be left hanging by its parched skin. Slowly, he raised an outstretched arm and pointed to Frank as if to announce a warning. A rasping, painful exhale came from his throat, and then his arm dropped by his side and he turned away. Frank hurried around him and continued on his way, but was shortly met by another soulless mortal. A woman dressed in rags, carrying a baby in his arms, staggered toward him. She and her child had the same vacant eyes and pale gray hue as the farmer, and the mother, her head covered with a tattered veil, and a hand raised out toward Frank, began to scream out a breathless warning, like a kettle on the boil, and it scared Frank to death. The baby in her arms mimicked the cry and started uttering the same pained expression that the farmer had. Tate! Tate! But then burst into a wail again. Frank covered his ears and ran by them yelling,
Stop! Please just stop!
The journey through the rice fields continued in the same manner throughout the day. On every stepped hilltop and descent, he would encounter more of the soulless bodies, usually on their own, but sometimes in groups of 2 of 3. All had the same stolen appearance and presented the same dire gestures and warnings. Most strained so badly to utter their words that their necks broke or simply froze as though stricken with paralysis. A few were able to complete more of their words, though their efforts produced the same horrific disfigurements, and Frank was able to piece together their warning. A certain type of chimpila called tatums were about, yet as that was all that was divulged. Their appearance, size, and number remained a complete mystery. This ignorance only served to stroke the fear in Frank all the more he continued through the fields, crouching and crawling, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. He recalled Pink Guy's vampire talks on how all the rice field realms were on the very edges of the omniverses and how anyone who found themselves there would know they were in the most desolate of places. He also remembered Pink Guy's words, warning of the unknown dangers lurking throughout the rice fields. He never mentioned the tatums by name, but he did speak of the awful entities that inhabited these regions. Did he know that Frank would end up here? Could he see it before it happened? Was there more to Pink Guy that he knew? Could Pink Guy be a chimpila himself, or possibly even a peace lord? Frank pondered these possibilities as he ventured closer toward the mountains, skirting the soulless folk who continued to come out to him. By evening, Frank had reached the base of the mountain and stumbled out from the edge of the rice fields onto firmer ground. Though the mountain was not a high one, its incline was steep and rocky from the rice fields, and Frank set up a small camp by their periphery. The sun dropped quickly over the horizon, and Frank made a small fire before the darkness was complete. The land grew eerily silent. Other than the soft cackle of the fire, there was no sound at all. Had he not just spent a long day encountering soulless beings issuing dire warnings, this might have actually been a beautiful and refreshing moment. But he had traveled too far and seen too much since leaving Okinawa to find any rest in any region. He wondered if he would ever know peace again. As he journeyed, he had collected some small crickets and grasshoppers from the rice fields to eat in the event that nothing more appetizing came his way. None did. So he prepared to barbecue them in the fire before munching on them. Yet a rustle suddenly came from the rice fields a stone's throw from where he was sitting, and he put the creatures back in his pocket. Another rustle followed shortly after from his right, and then another from his left, and then another again from immediately in front. Each rusting was followed by a piercing but shriek. Yeef! Frank's fear level went through the roof. Yef! A shriek echoed from another location. Within moments, the rice fields were filled with aggressive rustling sounds and the screams of Yef. Frank was on his feet and on guard. He began to sweat profusely and grabbed a small pointed branch he had gathered from the firewood in one hand and a second from the fire that burned fiercely in the other. He struggled for breath. These were surely the tatums that he had been warned about. Beyond the fire, there was a darkness as the abyss itself. Frank could see nothing. The scampering amongst the rice plants and the shrieks of Yef continued to heighten in frequency and intensity, until suddenly a small but vicious-looking creature darted out of the fields and stood scowling and sneering, and gnashing at Frank in the glow of the campfire light. It had the body of a marsupial and the face of a raccoon with rabies. Its head was crested with a bright yellow comb. Solid black eyes, glazed and wild, sat in ringed sockets, and its teeth looked like it had bitten into a bag of nails, and they had all just hung there. Immediately others appeared, at first just a few, but quickly others surfaced, till there were dozens surrounding him. They all shared similar fiendish features, but their combs were all of a different color, and each of them held rice sheaths in their paw, wielding them with heckles and murderous intent. One jumped toward Frank from the side and slashed a sheath across his calf, and in a flash bounded back to the safety of the rice fields with a gleeful chuckle. Frank looked at the small welt that was building on his flesh.
Hey, that hurt!
He said. While dabbing at it with his finger, two more attacked from the opposite side, leaving harsh red marks from the side of his other leg.
Mike, that's it!
He declared, as another leapt at him in attack from directly in front. Frank shoved the sharp branch he was holding right through the creature's palate. It dangled there, lifeless, as though a warning to any other who might venture toward him. The tatums hopped about insanely when they saw their kind impaled like that and began yeffing in a frenzied cacophony. A few more attempted to assail him, but Frank quickly found his valor. They were easily and proficiently dealt with. The first was struck hard with the burning branch, which knocked the top off its head and left it lying lifeless with an expression that would have been comical had its brain not been oozing out. Never before had Frank left so potent. There was almost a joy to the power he was feeling. The second was met with a perfectly timed kick to the groin, which sent it flying out into the night sky, screaming, "Yaf!" until the cry trailed off, rather beautifully, into the distance. This initial retaliation proved too much for the other tatums. There were a series of yefs called in a different tone, and suddenly all of them, except for one, bounded back off into the rice fields. That remaining one stayed firmly held under Frank's size 10 foot, screaming and yeffing for all it was worth, until Frank placed the sharp end of the stick in front of its ear and finished it with one thrust of his shoulder. He picked it up, collected the other carcass which had been impaled on the same weapon, and carried them both over to the fire. He roasted them, pleased in the knowledge that he would be enjoying a much more satisfying meal than the cricket's grasshoppers which he released from his pocket back into the patties. And when the tatums were ready, he feasted on them to the faint but rather delightful sound of yefs withdrawing off into the distance. As he ate, Frank grew curious as to the nature of his own powers and abilities, and the transformation that was continuing within him. He had never felt so powerful and had never struck at enemies so forcefully or effectively. The tatums were chimpillas, yet he squashed them aside as though they were bugs. Perhaps Frank himself was no longer a rank and file. He had jumped another tier. Was he now a chimpilla himself? How he wished Pink Guy were with him to help him understand this. Despite his exhaustion and his full belly, he was unable to sleep. He remained on a high, both in his victory over the tatums and in his wariness of the unknown that still lay ahead of him. He no longer considered any realm safe or peaceful. Every dimension required vigilance and care. Though the tatums were no longer a threat, something or someone else surely would be. He was wise in his appraisal. In the early hours of the morning, just as the glow of the sun was beginning to awaken the sky and that of the campfire embers was dying, he heard movement from the rice fields. This was not the light scampering of the tatums. This was heavy, sizable, even cumbersome. As he peered towards the sound, he could make out depressions in the fields as it moved. The sound grew louder as it snaked toward him, eventually stopping just short of the edge of the field, still partially hidden in the greenery. It lay there, observing Frank. Frank slowly reached over and picked up the sharp stick with which he had inflicted his toll on the tatums. At that point, the creature slithered out of the reeds and into the open. A massive centipede-like organism, it had a bulbous head and a face that approached human likeness except for its fearful ugliness. Its individual features probably qualified as human, in terms of function at least, but they were so weirdly arranged and disproportionate in size that Frank assumed its disfigurement had to be mutational.
Man, you are one ugly sucker!
Frank had no idea he had actually spoken the words until the creature replied.
Is that any way to speak to a guest?
It spoke in a deep, polished voice, one that would normally be associated with intellectual excellence.
I've come quite some distance to accommodate you, Frank, and to expedite your passage.
Who sent you?
Frank was on high alert and he held the branch firmly in his grip.
I sent myself.
It scratched the corner of its mouth as it spoke.
How do you know me? How did you know I was here?
The omniverses sing, Frank, and there is much talk of you across the ether. Indeed, it seems you have created something of a stir. Yet I suspect there is also some misinformation and misunderstandings about your present state, and I have come to offer you my counsel.
It would have been easier to accept this creature's words had it not been so hideously ugly. Frank held onto his stick defiantly.
I don't want to need your help. Leave me alone.
Frank, you have no idea what lies ahead of you. I do. You have already been warned by your pink friend of the hostilities of the rice field regions. I'm afraid even he doesn't know half of it. I will tell you. Frank, beyond here are pains and atrocities so awful they make the realm of the wretched look like a vacation. Believe me, you do not want to go on. Beyond this mountain are sufferings far worse than you can imagine, and your growing strength is not what you think it is. You have been deceived, Frank.
I just knocked out a whole score of chimpilas. How do you explain that?
The creature laughed, and as it did, convulsions rippled up and down its rubbery body from its head to its tail and back.
The tatums.
It laughed again, only more heartily this time.
You may as well have been fighting potato men. They're not chimpilas. They're just veg beasts and very poor ones at that.
It laughed again in a very deep, condescending way.
That's why you were able to defeat them so easily. Your powers are not growing, Frank. If anything, out here in these nether realms, you are actually weakening. You are susceptible to almost anything that attacks, and increasingly so. You cannot go on, and I regret to say that it may be too late to turn back. The true powers, the dark forces, are moving in this very realm as we speak. You are being surrounded, Frank. They want you gone.
So what are you telling me? I'm just a cactus and that's it?
Kill yourself, Frank. Kill yourself. The only way to save yourself from the terrors beyond this place is to take your own life. Take it before they do. Believe me, they will abuse you in ways you never thought possible. Take your life, Frank. Take it quickly.
Frank had been through so much already. He had seen such misery and suffering, experienced so much horror and evil, that taking his life no longer seemed scary or wrong. Yet something irked him about this creature. There was something distasteful and distrusting about it, and deep inside he knew that there was something more for him, a meaning and purpose that he had to find. He didn't have the fortitude to call it hope, but it kept him from despair. He grasped the stick in his hand and turned to head up the mountain.
Yo, I'm going on.
The creatures recoiled for a moment as Frank turned and walked from it. It then charged at him in a blind rage, and with its front appendages knocked Frank flying against the rocks at the base of the mountain.
You dare to defy me?
Its voice was now a guttural scowl.
Do you have any idea who I am?
It stood over Frank in a rage, saliva and mucus dripping from its mouth and other openings.
I am Tatorium. I am the lord of this land. I am the power you were warned about. You shall not pass. You shall not trespass my rice fields. And you shall never turn your back on me.
Frank stood up, his face inches away from the monster's odorous face. He looked deep into its eyes. Though afraid, he didn't fear this creature and recoiled again at Frank's stance.
That way!
Frank called, as though commanding it, and the creature instinctively did so at first, before rallying and attacking Frank with a roar that rang out over the fields and hills. Critters great and small, near and far, scampered away at the sound of it. As the chimpilla descended on him in a wild fury, Frank thrust the point of his spear through its bottom jaw. It reeled back in pain, and Frank went with it as he held fast to the branch, flying through the air, and landed on the creature's upturned belly.
Welcome to the rice fields, motherfucker!
He yelled, and with one almighty thrust of his weapon, he pierced its brain with a satisfying crunch. After writhing for a few desperate moments, it lay lifeless, a twisted, coiled pile of ugliness. Frank removed his spear, it was serving him well, and jumped with it from the belly of the beast. He surveyed the remains, stepping backwards to view it in its entirety. Though trembling with adrenaline, Frank was in awe of his own prowess. Whatever the tatums were, he had overcome them with ease. And now, he had overpowered Tatorium, surely the true chimpilla of which the soulless bodies had been warning him. Despite the chromosomes needed to repel and overpower the chimpilla, Frank still felt strong. He felt a power welling within him that he had never known before, and with it, he felt an innate desire to press on beyond this mountain. He knew there was something beyond it that dark powers didn't want him to know or find. Emboldened by this inherent knowledge and his victories in battle, he ascended the mountain in no time. From the summit, he had an inhibited view of the whole land, and most notably, an island which sat in the middle of a sea beyond the shores, rimming the foot of the mountain. Frank made his way down under golden sunshine, through lush, grassy fields, and felt a cool breeze blow off the water and through his hair. The freshness invigorated him, and he hummed a tune as he strutted toward the sparkling waters. The sand on the beach was fine and white. Frank removed his shoes and felt the grains tickle his toes. He lay back and enjoyed the warmth of the sun, high in a cloudless sky, massaging his face. Such respite was rare, and he savored the moment. With half-closed eyes, he listened to the gentle breeze gust across the water and play with the leaves of the trees which dotted the shoreline. Sitting up, he looked across the expanse to the island. It lay shrouded in a light fog that moved backwards and forwards across the landscape, revealing and concealing its features. The wind continued to move across the water from the island, picking up and carrying a soft sigh as it blew. As he listened, he began to make out words in the wind. At first, he denied it, but the more he listened, the clearer it became. It stunned him and left him standing perplexed. It was calling his name. In a faint but deep whisper, his name rolled over the surface of a deep. Frank! Frank! There were no signs of life on the beach, yet a far end, a wooden raft bobbed in the shallows, tied to a post protruding from a rocky ledge. With the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, Frank lost no time jumping onto the raft and using the oar upon it to paddle his way toward the island.